Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is SmartHER News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our SmartHER series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. During a typical news cycle, we commonly move between domestic stories and international headlines, and that hasn't been the case in 2020, as so much of our time is spent on the new coronavirus pandemic in America, and rightfully so. But that's not the way the year started. The year started with a focus on the Middle East and the targeting of a high-profile Iranian general by the United States. And in recent weeks, we've started to slowly turn our gaze back towards the Middle East with the devastating explosion in Lebanon and a quote-unquote peace deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. So we need some cliff notes, a challenge for the complexity of these topics in the region, but not insurmountable for our next guest. Jonathan Schanzer is Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., and someone who has always been generous with me as a journalist and SmartHER News from the beginning, which I appreciate, Jonathan. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So in broad strokes, and as I mentioned, this is a challenge, what should we know about the state of the Middle East in 2020?
Well, as always, the Middle East is a hotspot. There's good news and bad news. And I would say that over the last week, we've seen a healthy dose of both. On the one hand, you're watching a country begin to implode, and that country is Lebanon. Politically, economically, militarily, it is on a knife's edge. And that could have a spillover effect for the rest of the Middle East and possibly Europe. And at the same time, what we're watching is the potential for peace to break out, not only between the United Arab Emirates, a very wealthy Gulf country, and Israel, but that could be the beginning of a domino effect where other Middle Eastern countries begin to recognize Israel as well after 70 years of conflict. And so there could be a lot of good news on the horizon.
Well, you're touching on the two big topics that our audience has really asked about, what's going on in Lebanon and also, of course, this deal between Israel and the UAE. So let's start with Lebanon because it was such I don't know what to make of this coincidence, Jonathan, but you actually wrote an editorial that was published just a few hours before this massive explosion happened in Beirut, Lebanon. You were really focused on Lebanon, though, for a completely separate reason. Why were you interested in what was happening in Lebanon? What should we know about the state of that country?
Sure. So in earlier in the spring, I think maybe just a month or so after the coronavirus crisis had hit, Lebanon defaulted on its Eurobonds. It was, I think, $1.5 billion, but then it rapidly defaulted on a number of others, totaling, I think it was $4.5 billion, give or take. And that was a real red flag, because if you're a sovereign state and you can't repay your debts, and $4 billion is not a huge amount of money for a sovereign government, it's a sign that there is real economic sickness there. So FDD went out and asked an economist. We paid an economist to do a deep dive into Lebanon's economy. And what he came back with was nothing short of astounding. Lebanon is a country of 5 million people. It's tiny. It's like the size of the state of Delaware. And it has a $93 billion debt right now. The central bank is in the hole for $22 billion. The rest of the banking system's in the hole for $67 billion. There are the Eurobonds that I mentioned, not to mention a whole bunch of other problems economically that the country has. Politically, it's a disaster because the terrorist group Hezbollah, up until just a few days ago, was the linchpin for the government. So it was a real problem of legitimacy there. And then on top of that, they are really very close, a lot closer to war with Israel than many people realize, because Iran has been sending very dangerous weapons into the country so that Hezbollah could mount a conflict with Israel.
What really caught my attention about the editorial that you wrote, and you kind of list through these different variables of what was happening inside the country, is a sentence that you wrote about Hezbollah, the terrorist organization, as you mentioned, based in Lebanon, having an arsenal that was larger than some or all European nations that are a part of NATO. And that gives us an idea of why this terrorist group is powerful and why the United States has designated it a terrorist group for so long. Does the instability in Lebanon threaten America's national security or the security of our allies?
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, that statistic is absolutely correct. Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets right now that it has stockpiled. And they're of varying lethality and distance, but they have it's a huge arsenal. And it's kind of insane to think about the fact that they're a small group inside a small country, and that Iran has invested this much in its war-making capacity by proxy. Increasingly, there have been these what's called precision-guided munitions or PGMs. We know them kind of more broadly here in the United States as JDAMs, these joint direct attack munitions that allow us to be very, very precise when we go to war, so that we're able to hit exactly what it is that we target. Hezbollah has that. And so now all of a sudden, you have a terrorist group backed by Iran that could not only attack Israel, but also send these PGMs around to the Gulf. You think about the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, all these places where the U.S. has bases. They could be in danger as well. And of course, we know that Hezbollah has attacked Americans in the past, and we wouldn't rule that out today, given the conflict that Iran and the United States, we're really on a collision course right now. And Hezbollah is really a direct report to Iran.
This is one of the reasons why people really sat up suddenly when we heard of a massive explosion in Beirut, Lebanon. But at this point, Jonathan, do we have any more visibility as to the cause of the explosion or any questions surrounding how it happened?
I mean, the explosion itself is, it's kind of a ridiculous story. I mean, there was 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate sitting in a warehouse in the Beirut port for 6 years, unmonitored. Nobody was watching it. It wasn't temperature controlled. They weren't trying to move it or safeguard it. And according to what we understand, there was a fireworks warehouse right next door that, for one reason or another, had sparked a small explosion, and then that ended up touching off the ammonium nitrate, and it was like the equivalent of something like a quarter of a nuclear bomb, based on just happenstance. I mean, and this is the kind of thing, as an analyst in the Middle East, where I scratch my head and say, things like this don't just happen. And, I think there are real questions about whether Hezbollah was stockpiling that ammonium nitrate, waiting for the opportunity to create a larger bomb, or whether they were using bits of that ammonium nitrate for some of that arsenal that we mentioned. But no matter what, it's really hard to imagine that Hezbollah didn't have some role to play in the fact that ammonium nitrate, that huge amount of it, was sitting there in the Beirut port.
Unbelievable. One of the stories that we're going to continue to watch, I haven't heard from anyone except for you during this interview about how close Lebanon and Israel are to some sort of a conflict. And that makes our next topic of conversation sort of makes me want to turn or pivot in a way to place it differently, because we just got this announcement that there's a peace deal between Israel and UAE. What do you make of the announcement? How significant is it? And what about the timing?
So what I would say is that it's overdue. We've known about the fact that the UAE and Israel have had quiet diplomatic ties kind of under the table for a number of years. And actually, you have to look back to 2013, 14, 15 to understand why. And really, it all stems from that nuclear deal that President Obama signed. And it was so objectionable to Israel and the Gulf states that they began to talk quietly amongst themselves about their own interests. The reason why they were so unhappy is that they were the ones that were within missile range of Iran, and Iran was given all of this money, and they were promised that within 5 years the arms embargo would be lifted, and that, of course, is coming up very soon. And so these countries started talking, and a relationship developed. It was actually in many ways built upon their distrust of the United States at the time, but it's taken on a life of its own. And the UAE, in this case, made a deal with Israel in exchange for Israel halting its annexation of parts of the West Bank, which was somewhat controversial in the Middle East. But this was something that I think Israel was very happy to do for recognition and for a potential peace deal with this country. And what's really remarkable now is I can name probably 3 or 4 other countries that are very likely to follow suit very quickly. Bahrain is one of them. Sudan is another. Oman is another, possibly Morocco. These are all countries in the Arab world that were, I think, waiting for the first country to go. And then after that, I think the floodgates may open. And so this could be a really exciting time to watch the Middle East. It's very welcome good news.
Sometimes I don't think we slow down enough. And I certainly didn't understand this a couple of years ago, Jonathan, about Arab Muslim nations recognizing Israel or having diplomatic conversations. I didn't understand from an American citizen perspective what a big deal that was, because, when you're in America, people talk to each other.
Yeah.
So I feel, can you just take just a brief pause to explain that just doesn't happen in the Middle East between Israel as a Jewish nation and some of these Arab countries that are Muslim?
That's right. So, it stems from basically Israel's creation in 1948. It was created against the objections of all of the surrounding Arab states. And as soon as Israel was established, they went to war, tried to eradicate it. Israel was a country of about 600,000 people and miraculously survived an onslaught from 7 surrounding Arab countries. But ever since then, these countries have tried to wage war on multiple occasions and have failed. And Israel has grown in strength and economic power over the years. And I think, we've gotten to the point of maybe an acknowledgement on the part of a lot of these Arab countries that trying to destroy Israel is just not, it's not happening, and the effort's not worth it. And that, quite frankly, there are benefits to be gleaned, that they really have no major objections to Israel's existence. At the time, they were more concerned about the Palestinian cause, and they made it their own. I think that right now, these Arab states are kind of saying, you know what, the Palestinians, this is your problem. It's not ours. We're not going to fight a war for you any longer, when it might benefit us to have diplomatic relations with one of the most successful and strongest countries in the Middle East.
How much of that change of thinking has to do with the time and place we're in, both the fact that we're in the middle of a huge global pandemic that has caused all sorts of economic issues, amongst others, and it being election season in the United States and the Trump administration trying to, in this particular case, position this as a win for the administration specifically?
Yeah, I think that these countries, both the UAE and Israel, have a good relationship with the Trump administration, and I think I think it's safe to say they wanted to give Trump a win. I think they were very happy to do it. I'm not sure how much this really does impact the average American voter, where they say, well, I'm going to vote for Trump because he made peace between Israel and the UAE. But I do think that it won't go unnoticed. And I think that, if we start to see these dominoes start to fall where other countries follow suit, then I think it does change the equation.
What would it mean, Jonathan, if that's the case? If suddenly, just so for our audience, if they suddenly start seeing headlines where Morocco, for example, starts to follow in suit with the UAE, what is that? What is the signal? Why does that matter?
Well, what it means is that the overall kind of tension that we've seen in the Middle East, the sort of, people talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict as kind of the reason, or one of the reasons why you see extremism in the region, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda. But you would really begin to see as a change that would probably open up the Middle East economy. It would probably really contribute to stability in that part of the world, and also potentially signal a pivot against that radicalization that has been, such a problem in the region. all of these things might begin to kind of ease up a little bit, and I think that would be really a terrific development, and one that I think many of us saw it as a possibility. We just weren't sure when it would happen or exactly how it would unfold. This looks like the first move.
Interesting. There was something that you said at the beginning of our interview that I'd like to go back to, because there's certainly forces in the region that would not like to see that change. And you said that there's increasing tension between Iran and the United States. We really haven't talked a lot about that at all in the news. Jonathan, what should we know?
Well, right now there's a deadline coming for that arms embargo that I mentioned. It's the 5-year mark after the implementation of the Iran nuclear deal, where Iran would ostensibly be able to buy and sell significant weapon systems on the open market. And there is really a showdown coming right now between the Trump administration and the United Nations about the re-implementation of the sanctions pursuant to that 2015 nuclear deal. The Trump administration is saying we need to snap those sanctions back because of Iran's illicit nuclear behavior and because we can't afford to allow the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism to gain these kinds of weapons. So there is this real battle that's taking place right now. And of course, the Israelis are on the side of the Trump administration. Most of those Gulf countries that we were talking about are also on the side of the Trump administration. This is going to be a really interesting moment, and I think the real wild part of this is that it's the Brits and the French and maybe the Germans that are the ones that are on the fence here, and these are countries that should be with us in combating countries like Iran. So it's going to be a real interesting moment come October.
Why are they not with us?
Well, they signed an agreement. They bought into that agreement, and they thought they let's just say they accepted the perceived wisdom of the Obama administration back when that deal was signed. The Trump administration pulled out, and they were disappointed by it. They were unhappy by it, and this is kind of an extension of a long-standing disagreement that the Europeans have with the Trump administration about whether to appease Iran or to challenge it directly. And right now it appears that they are in the appeasement camp, and that's obviously disappointing.
There was so much debate about this deal when it was signed at the time, both inside the United States and around the world. And here, just as I kind of launch into our final question, Jonathan, really heating up, moving towards the presidential election in November. Vice President Joe Biden was part of the Obama administration when the Iran nuclear deal was signed. Just pointing that out, that the kind of the timing, the different perspectives of these two candidates, President Trump and Vice President Biden, that will be in front of the American people. And so just taking the politics away from it just for a moment, if we can, we'll take a deep breath and just ask this question. What is at stake for the next American president when it comes to the Middle East?
Well, I think it's an interesting question because right now I think the Biden folks have to be looking at this new peace deal and wondering whether this is something that they might be able to benefit from as well if Biden comes in and wins the election. That maybe trying to focus on the Palestinians was maybe not the right way forward here, and that maybe focusing on some of the peripheral Arab countries might yield more for the United States. On top of that, you're going to be looking at the potential for Iran to be buying and selling weapons on the open market. That's going to be something that would be a legacy of the Obama administration. Biden has to be thinking about that as well. And then there is I would say, the overall challenge of the radicalization. Right now, I'd say we've shifted away from kind of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and it's more the concerns about Hezbollah and Iran and how to counter it. And this was not the focus of the previous administration. It'll be interesting to see whether Biden shifts in that direction or if they go back to kind of the legacy policies that the Democrats had embraced 4 years ago.
It'll be interesting to see. One of the things that the Trump administration also is going to have to confront, if we look a little bit farther out, is Afghanistan. And we haven't talked a lot about that as well. That'll be a separate conversation. But kind of that the goal of winding down the war there isn't one that has been met. And that'll also be, again, a topic we haven't talked a lot about. A lot of American lives on the line in that war. And just one of those stories, Jonathan, that seems to get pushed to the margins.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, Jenna, that there is a really interesting debate that continues to play out in American politics, and it's not something that's discernible every day in the headlines, but there is kind of a debate, and this is within the Democratic and within the Republican parties, and that is this question of America's kind of international footprint, how willing we are to try to shape the outside world, or how willing we are to retreat to our own borders. And, when one looks back over the last century, we call it the American century because we shaped so much of the way the world looks right now. And I think very much for the better when you look at when you take a step back. But there are those who say that America has gotten too involved in too many foreign entanglements, and we've lost blood and treasure, and that we need to retreat to our own borders. And this is the debate that I think we're going to see within both platforms come November.
That's such a great way to end, and a really big picture question for our audience, which I always appreciate. Jonathan, it's always great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, SmartHER news, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing SmartHER.